So tonight I'm going to go back and forth between my new book, which I'll read some from, and I'll just kind of feel my way as to how much to read. Because of the snippet that was put in the flyer for this event, where somebody picked a little passage from the book about imagination, which theoretically you all saw because you looked at the flyer, and you still decided to come, which is very nice. And that thing was about imagination. So the book starts with 20 pages of poetry, ends with 20 pages of photography, and in the middle has hopefully interesting and provocative prose explorations of the concepts of financial return and soil fertility and billions and trillions of dollars versus billions and trillions of microbes, so just a lot of that. And I really did take a kind of a unusual course or track towards trying to spark imagination in the way I wrote the book. It's a very artistic book. It doesn't mean it's good art, it just means it's artistic, and it's an attempt to bridge left brain and right brain and heart and mind and get us feeling differently about money and our connection to one another in the places where we live. One of the kind of underlying themes of the book is about connecting and reconnecting. And that means connecting the left and the right brain and heart and mind, as well as connecting to one another and to the places where we live and to the soil and to the land. So, so I'm saying all that because I'll try to read enough from the book to give you a feel of the book, but I also believe that a number of people in the room will also want to hear about the arc that led up to the book and what's happening in Slow Money and the work that's happening on the ground. So if you stay too much up here, speaking about connection, you might think it's not connected to actual work on the ground, which it is. So maybe that would be a good way to just go to say this. Chuck actually referred to my first book quickly in his introduction. So I wrote a book 9 years ago called Inquiries into the Nature of Slow Money: Investing as if Food, Farms, and Fertility Mattered. So if you just think about that title. I would say when I wrote that book, not too many people would say they knew what fast money was. You know, when Carlo Petrini, the wonderful man from Italy, started Slow Food in Italy in 1989 in response to McDonald's opening in Rome, and he said, "We don't want any more fast food, we want slow food." And it just like hit. And now there's an international movement called Slow Food. But when I wrote Slow Money, there wasn't a big consciousness that money was too fast per se. We were about to have a collapse. I wrote the book right before the Great Recession. And there already were $600 trillion worth of derivatives zooming around. Anybody want to hazard a guess as to how many derivatives there are zooming around today? There were 600 trillion in 2008, 7 and 8 before the Great Recession. How many are there now?
10 times?
He's saying 10 times. He's extremely skeptical, but in the right direction. Over a quadrillion now. So there were 600 trillion. After a trillion comes a quadrillion. So it's not 10x, but it might be double. So it's hard to wrap your head around the fact that there's more of these instruments out there now than there was before the Great Recession. So the question of money running around out of control, and I'll get into touch on some of this in the slideshow, but I'm just trying to give you a sense of the overarching issues. Money zooming around out of control with no one really understanding it completely, and the no one is not just, I don't know if there are any, I know there's at least one financial professional in the room, and there might be more than one, but whether you're the most seasoned financial professional or the most sophisticated investment banker or hedge fund manager, or just a regular person, I still think the comment really applies that no one really understands what is going on completely. And now that things are so interconnected and so volatile and so fast, that we're much more vulnerable. It's funny that we call money securities when they actually make us less secure. And the same thing goes for nuclear weapons and a bunch of other things. So on that ominous note, I'm going to proceed. So I gave a talk, in Boulder. One of the things I'm going to touch on during the course of my remarks is a project called Soil. So this is both the actual soil and the metaphorical soil, soil standing for Slow Opportunities for Investing Locally, which is a funny acronym that some of my friends in San Francisco came up with. And I was getting ready to talk about, I'll mention that as I go through my remarks. Again, that'll be part of the discussion of what's actually happening on the ground And I was getting ready to go to someone's house in Boulder last week, and we had a group about this size in Boulder. And I heard the night before on the BBC the following two stories. So I'm still lingering a little bit on the systemic dysfunctions that I'm trying in one tiny little way, and the thousands of people doing slow money in a tiny little way, just to do something that is a pure alternative to all these systemic dysfunctions. So the punchline is making a small loan to a farmer down the street. Simple act. Why should that be radical? Why should it be complicated to do that? Why isn't everybody doing that? How many people here want there to be more small and mid-sized organic farms within 50 miles of where they live? Okay, how many of you have made a loan to a farmer? Yahoo! Oh, damn. Well, I know some. No, well, great, fantastic. But so you think about it. Why is this? If all of our money is still sitting in banks and sometimes community financial institutions, sometimes complicated, distant securities, or whatever, but we want these things in our community, but we're afraid to do them for a whole lot of reasons. We're afraid they're too risky, right? One of the first radio interviews I ever did about slow money, when the first book came out, the radio interviewer said, "How are you ever going to get people to do it? It's so risky." And I said, well, risky compared to what? If you don't think it's risky to have your money zooming around in smokestacks in China and all kinds of cockamamie stuff that no one understands, then just keep doing that. I think that's risky. So it's one thing we know is when farmers get up every day, they are risking pretty much 100% to grow food for us. And in the process, if they're farming in the most ecologically correct way possible, they're putting carbon back into the soil, they're keeping water in the ground, they're preventing soil erosion and surface runoff, they're keeping toxics out of the environment, they're creating healthy food for our kids. I mean, that's a lot of things I just said. And so connecting to them is a way to begin rebuilding communities, and I would argue even rebuilding democracy. So there's a lot of things all tied together here. And I was on my way to the Boulder talk, and I heard the following two stories on the BBC. The first one, so if you listen to the BBC, you might remember hearing this. It stuck in my mind because they were right next to each other, the two stories. The first one was, in 2050, there's going to be more plastic in the oceans. The volume of plastic, one study projected, the volume of plastic in the ocean will exceed the volume of marine life in the ocean. Now, when I heard that, I thought, that is not possible. That is completely preposterous. So whether it's true or not, just the fact that someone thinks it's going to happen, you know, we got a problem there. So the next story was about the fire in Los Angeles, because that was the day the fire started. And the story was, the fire went from nothing to 50,000 acres in 24 hours. It's the first time that they'd ever recorded a fire spreading that fast. So those two stories were back to back. Then as I was going to bed, I was surfing around a little bit, and I found an article in the New Yorker by Masha Gessen, that some of you probably read some of her stuff, or she's on TV occasionally. And it was about a new political party starting in Sweden. And unfortunately, I was up in Portsmouth the other day. I'd written some notes on it, but the gist of it is, it's a very informal kind of populist, hip, new internet party. And the three crises they're trying to address in the party are the crisis, the loss of faith in democracy, the environmental crisis, and the mental health crisis. So again, I just flagged it as, okay, our systems are breaking down. The ecological systems are breaking down. The environmental systems. Then, while I was driving to the talk, I heard another thing that just blew my mind. So thank you for letting me share this. There was a story about a new app that is being tested in Tokyo, and the app is for pregnant women. Now, you're going to think I'm making this up. I do have a good imagination, but it's not that good. I'm not making this up. Pregnant women coming onto subway cars in Tokyo can ping other people who have the app to let them know that they're pregnant and they need a seat. And the reason they developed the app is because everyone on the subway cars is going like this. No one is looking around. So the only way for the pregnant women to contact, I'm not making this up. You can Google it, you'll see that it's true. So what are we going to do? Are we going to do something? Our systems are breaking down. Our social contract is breaking down. Pretty much everything is breaking down. And I think it's incumbent upon us to find a few direct positive things to do. You can try to change politics. You can try to change institutional governance, all very important. You can try to change massive flows of capital and sort of improve make them less destructive through various kinds of funds and whatnot, all important. But to me, nothing is as important as just working at the grassroots and just connecting directly in the places where we live and trying to rebuild from the ground up. And so hopefully, by the time I finish this, you'll know why I think that, and maybe you'll share some of those feelings and desires to act. Okay, I think I should just start going through the PowerPoint because it'll give you some more context. Those of you who've ever seen me speak before are now, at this moment are rolling your eyes because I always start with this pig. You will notice that this pig is outdoors if you are observant, meaning it's not in a cage being pumped full of antibiotics with 5,000 or 10,000 other genetically identical hogs, which is the way most of the pork in this country is grown, is raised. And it happens to be raised by a company called Newman Ranch, which I'm not here to promote Newman Ranch, but some of you might know that company. It has been one of the pioneering companies of small-scale, sustainable hog production. There are 1,000 hogs on this farm outside on 150 acres. So just think, 1,000 hogs outside on 150 acres versus 5,000 or 10,000 hogs in a quarter-acre barn in crates being shot full of antibiotics. And that metaphor is the metaphor for everything. That's our money is confined in institutional things. Everything we do is consolidated, commodified, pumped full of stuff to make it grow faster. Just saying, this metaphor that applies to finance and nature versus, let's say, doing it the right way, the humane way, the ecologically sound way, more diversity, more soil fertility, et cetera. So when I put this, if I weren't trying to rush through a whole thing about slow money in the book and everything, we'd pause for a long time on this slide and I'd say, stare that pig in the face and think about how your investments are affecting other living things on the planet. And so let's just do a 10-second version of that. Just look at that hog for 10 seconds. All right, as far as soil goes, a whole topic on the actual soil, not on slow opportunities for investing locally or the soil as a metaphor for the ground. So these are 3 random quotes. I'm guessing people in the room will know some of these. So the first one is Jefferson, cultivators of the earth are the most valuable of citizens. Now that quote, I've been educated since I've used it a few times. It is charged because of his relation to slavery and some other things. So I actually, whenever I saw that quote before being brought to my attention, I really read it as we were a nation of farmers when the nation was formed. When we're hearing, I'm already seeing some dissonant people in the front rows. That's okay. So I'm not here to argue that point per se, but I'll just say it is interesting to think that, let's say, as recently as 1900, like how many farmers were there in the United States in 1900? A lot. Did you say a lot? Boston is a very educated crowd. I see that it's very, that is true. Someone take a guess. I don't even know the exact number. I know ballpark. About 50 million. 50. Now, you know, does that count couples and things or whatever? But just say about 50 million. Out of the population was about 150 million then. So it's like a third of the population was still directly involved in farming. And now we're down less than 2 million farms. Of course, the average farm size has gone up dramatically in the corporate ownership and all kinds of other things. So that's the point. That's what I take away from that. The other issues are complicated and are there. The second quote is FDR, a nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. And I've never tried to figure out where that came from. I know it's him. It's often quoted. Just interesting that somewhere along the way, when he was speaking to a farm group probably, he said that. And the last one is David Montgomery, who's current. He's a MacArthur Fellow. He just spoke at our big event we had in Boulder in October, a national event. The degradation of soil and the loss of organic matter are the most underappreciated environmental crises humanity now faces. So you came to this talk with the word soil there, so I'm assuming some of you are already pretty deep into the subject because it's not a sexy topic to the general public. But the issue of soil and carbon sequestration and a whole bunch of other issues, but mostly the carbon sequestration part is going to become a much more prevalent part of the national conversation over the next decade, let's say. Among anybody who cares about carbon in the atmosphere is going to care about carbon in the soil. How many people here are pretty schooled in this already have been in discussions of this? So about half of you. So it turns out that plowing releases carbon from the soil into the atmosphere. Just think about how basic that is. The plow is like the iconic, you know, amber waves of grain and plowing and thing, you know. Turns out that system of agriculture puts carbon into the atmosphere, in addition to all the other issues of industrial agriculture. So we've got some work to do. The hardcore proponents of soil for climate, that group, actually, I shouldn't single them out per se, but let's say deep proponents of soil as a mitigation to climate change argue that it's theoretically possible to sequester all of the carbon that has got, whatever pre-industrial carbon levels were. Someone here might know that number. Was it like 180 or 260? Okay, thank you. So before the Industrial Revolution, there were 260 parts per million in the atmosphere. Now we're up to 410 or something, or whatever it is. The hardcore proponents of the role of organic agriculture or regenerative agriculture, different terms for what is the transition we're trying to promote, is that we could actually bring atmospheric carbon down to below pre-industrial levels, slight if all the farmland on the planet was farmed organically. So, but still, it's just interesting to know that there is a cycle there by which carbon goes from the atmosphere through plants and goes back into the soil where it belongs, where it holds water, where it supports life, etc. So you'll be hearing more about that. The premise of my first book can be summarized in this sentence. As it circulates the globe with ever-accelerating speed, money sucks oxygen out of the air, fertility out of the soil, and culture out of local communities. And when I wrote that, I really did not intend it as an actual description. I just felt it was like a metaphoric thing. And the more I talked to people and the more I I realized, no, it's an actual phenomenon. From that book, which came out in December 2008, a small movement has emerged called Slow Money. We have 17 local networks, 11 investment clubs. You can see some of the data on here. I would just say we have lots of groups that get together kind of like this in dozens of communities and make believe that I wasn't here and there were 2 or 3 farmers or chef-to-table restaurateurs or someone with a seed company or a soil building company or whatever, and they were pitching for small loans. And you guys were deciding whether you wanted to give them loans or not. That's all Slow Money really is groups of people getting together around the country to get a little of their money into the local food system and supporting organics. And I did put a couple of bombastic quotes on there, just so you saw that it might be going somewhere. Bill McKibben said slow money is one of the keys to a healthy future. And Tom Steyer, who is now famous for the impeachment campaign, very controversial, said slow money is an idea whose time has come. This is what it looks like in action. Again, you know what meetings look like. So we have meetings large and small. I did want to draw your attention to the following. This was before I wrote around the time I wrote the book. I was trying to crystallize some of these thoughts, and it kind of came out like this. And to me, this is my version of like a fiduciary trying to have imagination. That's supposed to be a slightly humorous comment. It's not a pretty process, but I was trying, and this is what came out. Paul Newman said, in life we need to be more like the farmer who puts back into the soil what he takes out. And that happens to be the last line in Paul Newman's obituary in the New York Times, which is how I discovered it, and I got goosebumps that was the last line of a full page. His obituary is a full-page article, a full page in the New York Times. Recognizing the wisdom of these words, let us ask, what would the world be like if we invested 50% of our money within 50 miles of where we live? Now that question came up when I was running Investor Circle, the angel network that Chuck mentioned. That question first came to me before I wrote either book. And I was trying to think, how can we, well-intentioned people who have some money, we want to do things that will have fundamental impact, and yet we're having so much trouble getting there. Like what's stopping us? And the first thing I came to was place. We're not connected to the places where we live. We're investing in markets. We're investing in abstractions. So if I say the following to you, I'm curious how many people agree with this. We're giving our money to people we don't know very well, to invest in things they don't understand very well, halfway around the planet in places most of us will never visit. Does that sound like the recipe for a healthy future? Okay, that's called nervous laughter. All right, so to me, one thing we can do in response to that, we're all complicit in that because we have to do something with our money and we have to put it somewhere, is taking some of it and putting it to work near where you live in things that you understand. And to me, the most tangible thing is food. It wouldn't have to be just food, but I'm focused on food in the soil, and you might have already detected that I'm a fan of Wendell Berry and E.F. Schumacher, Small is Beautiful. I mean, those are the things that affected me a lot, and I'll have a little more to say about that. So this thing about 50 miles of where we live, again, you could say that's just a crazy thought experiment. And if you think about it for a while, just think, why the hell aren't we doing that? Everything is breaking down all around us. All of the big systems are out of control because they're too big, too complicated, very hard to regulate, volatile, confusing. Incentives are way out of control. It's too easy for a few people to make too much money. All these things, we know that's the case, and yet all of our money is still kind of sitting somewhere on the edges of all of that or directly in it. Why is it so radical to say, what would happen if we actually said, damn it, we're taking 50? So it's a good thought experiment. We don't have time to go too far in it. You have to think about, what would I do if I had to take 50% of my money and put it to work for 50 million? What would we do? What kind of discussions would we have to have? How would we understand risk? I mean, it's just an interesting thing. Then what if there were a new generation of companies that gave away 50% of their profits? That's a little bit riff on Patagonia and Newman's Own and whatnot. Meaning, in this case, for every dollar that would go to the shareholders, a dollar would go to the community somehow. Just a much more, let's say, radical restructuring of dollar flows, betokening the severity of the decline of our communities. And the last one is, what if there were 50% more organic matter in the soil 50 years from now, which is a twist that goes down into the soil. And all of these, the reason I had these 50-50 things in there is because I feel like, what are the odds we're going to figure out how to go in a different direction? I don't know. Maybe if they're 50-50, we're lucky. But so that's the fiduciary trying to have imagination. Okay. So then came this new book. I think I'll probably pause and read something from it in a second. And I hope this is useful context because the imaginative, the book is, there is some pretty crazy stuff in the book. Hopefully crazy good, meaning just flights and experiments and dashes out into the kind of the edges of the fiduciary universe and beyond. I never said it that way before. I don't know where the fiduciary universe ends. John, you'll have to tell me that later. So I wanted you to have some context that there's a bunch of us. These conversations are all up here, and then the action is down on the ground, and there is action on the ground. So this book, the title of the book, which I don't know if you can all read it on there, is presented in a very visually challenging way. And there's a lot of, whoops, sorry about that. There's a lot about M.C. Escher in the book. And if you look at the word soil and the number 2017, if you flip the number soil down as if it was on a hinge, it makes a corrupted version of the number 2017. And so there's a whole lot in the book about how we look at things, and dualities, and unities, and connections, and figure ground, of course, M.C. Escher. So the title of the book is what's in white, Soil, Notes Towards the Theory and Practice of Nurture Capital, and the playful subtitle beyond the number is Of Earthworms, Billionaires, Aha Moments, Mythic Implications, and the Considerable Virtues of Bringing Our Money Back Down to Earth, not all of it, of course, but enough to matter. That's supposed to be a little bit playful. And I discovered, after I wrote this book, that there's a name for my writing style, and it's lively serious, as opposed to deadly serious. And that's for a reason, because economics is the dismal science, right? When we talk about money, we get deadly serious. And guess what? A lot of the ways we make money is by killing things. Not necessarily directly, but you know, there is a thing, those of us who are of a certain age remember a thing called the military-industrial complex. It never gets talked about much anymore. That's a thing, and it's a huge part of the economy. Cigarettes are a part of the economy. Ambulances are part of the economy. There's a lot of things that kill people that make money. And Wendell Berry is famous for saying, you know, you can't make money on peace, you make money on war. A lot of people have said that. So, lively serious instead of deadly serious. So whether you like lively serious after tonight or not is up to you, but that's what you're getting. Here's an example, because the first words in this book, when you open the book, are, if it's true that we are what we eat, may it also be true that we are not what we tweet. I'm going to pause for more laughter. Come on, that's supposed to be a yuck. So what did you say?
Does it apply to Trump? The last line.
Yes, well, of course. So this book could be described as my primal scream against tweets. It's the opposite of a tweet. There's nothing that could fit into 140 characters except this, which somebody tweeted when I spoke at a conference, which is kind of a crazy thing. All right, So there's a lot of poetry in the book, some of it very playful, some of it more serious. I already told you about the image of the title. So how many people here have never heard of M.C. Escher? Cool. All right. This is Boston, very educated crowd. So I'm just bringing a little Escher back into our lives. I mean, most of us, I think, maybe haven't thought about him for quite a while. So these are two M.C. Escher. So just look at the figure ground, multiple planes, unity beyond duality. The fact that these are black and white figures is also means something. All right. Here's another one. This one gets a little bit more into rural, urban, towns, nature, geometry. So, okay, since I showed those slides, I have to get to a thing here on the Escher. I would like to offer for M.C. Escher's posthumous consideration, you have to stick with me here, the following as a figure ground stumper. So these are figure ground images, right? Here's a figure ground stumper, industrial food systems. Industrial food systems are a figure without a ground. CAFOs, GMOs, NPK, high fructose corn syrup, Roundup, mouthfeel texturants, polysorbate 80, trans fats, yellow dye number whatever, feedlots, manure lagoons, cocoa puffs, untold BTUs spent processing, distributing, refrigerating, and freezing food. These are all part of a figure that has no ground. And a figure without a ground, like a house divided, cannot stand. So I just wanted to give you a little flavor of that. And it occurs to me that I kind of did a disservice by not reading the note to the reader at the beginning of the book, so let me do that now. So this will give you a feeling for the whole gestalt of this book. Now, I felt the need to write a note to the reader because the book starts with 20 pages of fairly, Chuck, would you like to put an adjective on the poem? Spicy. All right. So the premise of the poem, it's called Poetically Incorrect, is the name of the poem. And the premise is that a dozen or so gods, goddesses, and one real person. And the one real person is Masanobu Fukuoka. For those of you, I'm going to see some nods who know that he wrote The One Straw Revolution, a very radical Japanese organic farmer who's no longer alive. So he and a bunch of made-up mythical characters have gathered by the Continental Divide in Colorado for an emergency meeting to see if they can figure out how to save mankind. That's the premise of the poem. So it's a lot, and because I started the book that way, I felt that I had to prepare the reader a little, so that I wrote the note to the reader. I'm sad as hell, and I'm not going to fake it anymore. There needs to be just a little more audience response to that. Meaning that some of you recognize where it came from. Right, okay. Slow down. Thank you very much. I will slow down. So that is a reference to I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore from the movie Network, which I won't describe more. So I'm sad as hell and I'm not going to fake it anymore. Our democracy is ebbing and carbon is flowing. Into the atmosphere, that is, instead of back into the soil where it belongs. I'm sad as hell, and I'm not going to forsake it anymore. Poetry, that is. To be sure, quirky, playful poetry is an idiosyncratic response to $100 billion arms deals, nuclear uncertainty, a quadrillion dollars worth of derivatives, hunger, obesity, and the invasion of every facet of life by media and markets. But when I went looking for a meaningful response to the fakery of our current predicament, poetry is what I found. Turns out that while you can't make this shit up, and the truth is stranger than fiction, someone really did make this shit up. History is a nightmare from which we really do need to awake, and poetry may be truer than the realest news. This is a call to farms, a call to all who plant, grow, harvest, eat, hug, argue, clink, put up, squirrel away, fritter away, lay away, and otherwise regret that civility and community went that away. A call to gather our wits, one farm at a time, one town at a time, one county at a time, one watershed at a time, one refusal to argue about politics at a time, one sleeve rolled up at a time. Just why is it, anyway, that the economy keeps growing, military spending keeps exploding, Drug prices keep soaring. The stock market keeps lifting off. But the strength of our marriages, the health of our kids, the vitality of our main streets, and the fertility of our soil keep going down. My search for answers, encouraged by conversations with thousands of folks around the country, leads me to explore the boundaries between heart and mind, between finance and poetry, between fiduciary responsibility and free-range imagination. Is the sky really falling this time? It has fallen before. After the Holocaust in Hiroshima, the assassinations of JFK, RFK, and MLK, the war in Vietnam, it's so hard to read the sentence because it's dark, Kent State, Watergate, Black Monday, Enron, 9/11, shock and awe, Bernie Madoff, the Great Recession. Now in the second decade of the 21st century, climate change, terrorism, widening wealth inequality, and fake news are clamping down on our consciousness. We need to discover new ways to bend entropy, befuddlement, and violence towards beauty, health, and peace. That's what bunches of us have been doing in very small ways since 2009 in tents, barns, theaters, performing arts centers. Actually, I don't list churches, they're here. Farmers markets, restaurants, and other gathering spots in scores of communities around the country, and a few in Canada, France, and Australia under the loose banner of slow money. More than $57 million has gone to over 600 small organic food enterprises. Yes, we are putting a little of our money into local food systems, but what is driving us forward is something more, an impulse towards beauty, health, and peace. There's also a more basic impulse. It's the impulse to be real neighbors rather than fake neighbors. Fake meaning our cars are parked here, our kids are in school here, we shop here, our roofs are pounded by the same hailstorms, but most of our money is doing God knows what, God knows where. Our political energies are swallowed up by national and international shenanigans, and our bonds as community members are wanting. As this volume was being put to bed, Richard Haass, president of the Council on Foreign Relations, stated, "We just have to face the fact that our government isn't working." Add to this what Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz said a few years back. We aren't fixing the structural problems of the economy because we don't know what the structural problems are. We sense that macroeconomic fixes and national political debates are not enough. We sense that what we are being fed is not healthy. We sense that our cultural compass is no longer reliable, which is why we are all going a little bit crazy right now. If we are going to change course, really and truly change course, we must start by standing our ground against things dumbed down, watered down, Twittered down, trickled down, and hunkered down, against things overly politicized, polemicized, marginalized, externalized, rationalized, systematized, professionalized, fiscalized, intellectualized, and anti-intellectualized. In this pursuit, I've gone poetically incorrect because I harbor the suspicion that deep down, deeper down than the Ogallala Aquifer and the deepest recesses of fear, millions of us can still find the wherewithal to allow rhyme to flirt with reason in the land of the free and the home of the peaceably inclined. So that's the note to the reader. And now, to be a little more lively serious, I feel I should read the following, which is the opening of the second chapter called Return. Now remember, this is a book which is actually about finance in some ways. It's a very unusual approach, but you can't have any book about finance that's radical and not talk about our concepts of financial return. So you will see that the way I'm approaching return is way broader than that. Return. Excuse me. Salmon return. Boomerangs return. Hindus return. When things work out, investments return. Letters with insufficient postage return. So do infections, mosquitoes, prodigal sons, wandering eyes, sideways glances, the hands of a clock, circular reasons, not quite infinite seasons, pendulums, memories, criminals to the scenes of their crimes, and stories to where they left off. Prior to the advent of colony collapse disorder, bees returned. Heroes, real and mythic, return. Odysseus, Columbus, General Douglas MacArthur. Too many winks, verdicts, and tennis serves have been returned over the course of human history to be counted. The same goes for sweaters after Christmas. You are just a really tough crowd tonight. That is, I'm not going to beg, well, I am going to beg. And as long as there have been neighbors, economists, democratic entanglements, and governments, there have been many happy returns, diminishing returns, election returns, and tax returns. Through it all, however, through all these physical, spiritual, emotional, postal, historical, mythical, electoral, recreational, and commercial goings and comings, there is one thing in our infinite industrial wisdom and pioneering spirit that we haven't returned: carbon. Okay, finally. Jesus, come on, you guys. All right, that's a relief. All right. So I will read one or two more sections of the book before I'm done, but let's go back through the arc of the slideshow. So don't worry about trying to read the words. I just wanted you to see the piece of paper, and you'll see, if you remember the cover, there's this tattered piece of paper behind the cover, which is actually that sheet of paper. What is that sheet of paper? It's the sheet of paper I have carried around that I may have lost in Portsmouth the day before last, actually, unless they sent it to me, that has a quote from Wendell Berry on it. And I've carried it around for 10 years of Slow Money Talks. And it is, let's see if I can find where it is in here so I can read the damn thing. It is where the word nurture stuck into my consciousness. And you would think I'd be able to find it in here. I may have to read it off the screen. Here it is. Okay, so Wendell Berry. And I said, I mentioned in passing before, so Wendell Berry and E.F. Schumacher are basically like the two men who ruined my life, you know, if we want to put it that way. So I read them, I felt them. I've had the great good fortune of getting to know Wendell some, and I felt they were right. They were telling the truth. And if I felt that they were telling the truth, how would I be able to take what they're saying and put it into practice, right? So I've been trying ever since to put their wisdom into practice. I actually read this passage when I became chairman of Investor Circle, the angel network that Chuck mentioned. So imagine this, a group of a couple of hundred ultra high net worth investors who are trying to invest in green things, simplifying it. And the first thing I did when I became chairman of the organization was I read this passage to them. And even though as a group, and actually there's a former board member of that organization right here, even though as a group it was impossible to really act on this, even in that group of super sophisticated financial people, you could feel the energy of this. And that said to me, there's some truth here that we need to keep working on. So this is from The Unsettling of America, Wendell Berry's, maybe his classic. He's written 50 books. Those of you who, if anybody here doesn't know Wendell Berry, he hasn't won the Nobel Prize yet, which hopefully he will. He certainly deserves one. He's written about 50 books about food, farming, culture. Very deep, wonderful Kentucky farmer and poet and writer. I conceive a strip miner to be a model exploiter. And as a model nurturer, I take the old-fashioned idea or ideal of a farmer. The exploiter is a specialist and expert. The nurturer is not. The standard of the exploiter is efficiency. The standard of the nurturer is care. The exploiter's goal is money, profit. The nurturer's goal is health. His land's health, his own, his family's, his communities, his country's. Whereas the exploiter asks of a piece of land only how much and how quickly it can be made to produce, the nurturer asks a question that is much more complex and difficult. What is its carrying capacity? That is, how much can be taken from it without diminishing it? What can it produce dependably for an indefinite time? The exploiter wishes to earn as much as possible by as little work as possible. The nurturer expects certainly to have a decent living from his work, but his characteristic wish is to work as well as possible. The competence of the exploiter is in organization. That of the nurturer is in order, a human order, that is, that accommodates itself both to other order and to mystery. The exploiter typically serves an institution or organization. The nurturer serves land, household, community, place. The exploiter thinks in terms of numbers, quantities, hard facts. The nurturer in terms of character, condition, quality, kind. This is more than a remarkably coherent passage about the tension between quality and quantity, industrial and agrarian. It is the organizing vision for a whole new financial sector, nurture capital, at least that's what I hear. All right, so that's where the idea of nurture first planted its seed in me. The book that I'm reading from, I just wanted to show a few spreads, is wildly visual and as playful and visual as it is in linguistics. And that's because of, I didn't read a bunch from the MC Escher section, but it's because of this idea of reconnecting left brain and right brain and heart and mind. We need to see things whole again. I don't think there's anybody who challenged us to do that better than MC Escher by creating dualities and then forcing us to see unities that were bigger than the dualities. So the book is very playful in visuals. I just wanted you to see a few of the spreads just to get an idea of it. So it is fun to look around in. Okay, those genes, I don't think I'm going to be able to read this, and I didn't flag this page. Here it is. Here's what the footnote, the side note says next to those genes, because you can't really see them very clearly. Barracuda genes, these are real genes. Barracuda genes recently featured at Nordstrom are described thus: heavily distressed, medium blue denim jeans in a comfortable straight leg fit embody rugged Americana workwear that's seen some hard-working action with a crackled, caked-on, muddy coating that shows you're not afraid to get down and dirty. $425. $425. And I think I'm not making this up. I think they sold out pretty fast. All right, so, all right. Scale. Those of you who might have done a little of the math when I showed a slide that showed all the little groups and 57 million and 600 deals, whatever, there's a lot of very small investing going on in slow money, meaning over 8 or 9 years that the investment was going on. It's everything from a few $1,000s. There was one investment that was a few $1 million, but that's an outlier. But to stick at this, to decide, for instance, I've often shared this remark. So Oscar Wilde once said, the whole problem with socialism is that it requires too many evening meetings. Okay, so here we are at an evening meeting. We are not here to discuss socialism. We are here to discuss what I think of as a highly sociable form of capitalism. All right? But it does require evening meetings. Therefore, it's not for everyone. You have to be willing to roll your sleeves. You have to be willing to have an attitude that says, this is not an inefficiency that has to be endured on the way to a few small investments. This is the actual process. We're actually building relationships that are as valuable as the transactions. The very act of coming together and spending the time is an investment. It's a beautiful thing. But to feel that, you have to believe that lots of small things could possibly add up to systemic change, right? One venture capital round of financing is $50 million. One investment from one venture firm might be $50 million in one round, right? We've done $60 million over 8 years, thousands of hours of meetings and people. Why is it worth it? Well, you got to decide where you think things make sense, and if that's where you want to focus. You have to decide what you believe actually is real and whether you are willing to invest in it. So here are 4 slides that raise the question of, in the food system, of scale. And when I go through these, think about a whole bunch of things. Which things make more sense to you? Which things feel better? Which ones would be the easier way to make money? Those are not the same ones necessarily, right? So the first slide is a trick one. This is from the Chobani website. This is from the Chobani website, where it talks about our craft and what goes into a cup of Greek yogurt and whatever. So Chobani, some of you may know, went from 0 to $1 billion in 10 years. Got on 60 Minutes, the guy's a hero. It's actually an interesting story. There are many interesting things about the company. The founder grew up Kurdish in a shepherd's family. They employ lots of immigrants, and there's a lot of positive things there. I'm only referring to the scale of the yogurt production right now. So please don't construe this as a cheap shot against the company Chobani. But I was concerned when I went on the website in the course of writing the book and saw that picture and thought, wow, that is not where you're getting your milk, dudes. You should not have that picture on your website. That is not okay. They are not getting 11 million pounds of milk a day to feed their new Twin Falls, Idaho plant. That's just their Idaho plant. They have one plant up in New York and the other one they just built in Idaho. And that plant processes 11 million pounds of milk a day. Does anybody think it's coming from farms that look like that? So that pissed me off when I saw it, because there's no need. It's an interesting company in a lot of ways, but that is not one of the ways. But they felt the need to put this on their website. Why? That says to me they feel a little guilty about the reality of what they're actually doing, which looks a lot more like this. Now I want to say this did not come from their website, obviously. So it's not a picture of Chobani, but it is a picture of industrial scale modern milking, which is necessary to source 11 million pounds of milk a day. There's a lot more to say about this. In terms of animal welfare, in terms of health of the milk, the quality of the milk, in terms of the soil, meaning these animals hardly ever are out on pasture, therefore they're not part of the natural cycle of grazing and soil fertility, etc. Just a footnote on this. One of the many things you should know about is something called Alan Savory, the Savory Institute, Holistic Management. I see nodding heads. So a very strong international proponent of the role of intensive outdoor grazing to rebuild soil fertility and whatnot. And just think of like the bison grazing on the Great Plains, where huge herds would be concentrated for a day or two in a place, eat the grass, pee and poop, hoof it up, and then move on. Turns out that process is vital to building soil fertility over millennia. So if you don't have the animals outside doing that, but you have them in cages and are feeding them corn, it's a totally different thing. All right. I'll just keep going here in the interest of time. So that was $0 to $1 billion in 10 years, Chobani. Stonyfield Farm, 0 to, someone here might know better numbers than I do. I'll say 400 million. I don't know where they are now. But something like that. It might be 500 million. But over 30 years. So 0 to $1 billion in 10 years, 0 to 400 or 500 million over 30 years. All organic. Probably I would argue maybe the premier mass-produced organic yogurt you can get. It is now an industrial organic brand. If the CEO, the old founding CEO, Gary Hirschberg, was here, he'd be chewing my ear off about all the things I'm not saying right now. It's a good company, just in the interest of showing how complicated this is, I invested in this company when I was treasurer of the Jesse Smith Noyes Foundation. It was one of the better investments financially we made at that time. So life is complicated. I'm not here to like take cheap shots at anybody. So $0 to $400 or $500, meaning $1 million of yogurt a day or so. Oops. Okay, Jack Laser, one of my personal heroes. Butterworks Farm yogurt, which you can get in Boston probably. Yeah. So I was living on Martha's Vineyard at the time. While I was an investor in Stonyfield, I was a customer. I was eating Butterworks Farm. So one family farm, 350 acres or so, 10 miles south of the Canadian border. They've been there forever. Old hippies moved there, stayed there. And they have about 60 Jersey cows. They make as much yogurt as they can make on their farm. And it is one of the most sustainable farming enterprises I have ever seen. Anybody want to guess how much yogurt they make a year on that farm? Anybody just want to take a wild guess? Well, I wasn't thinking in gallons. He said 5,000 gallons. I was thinking in dollars, but $1 million a year of yogurt. They just maxed out. They're not at 5. They are? No, $1 million. $1 million worth of yogurt. Rough numbers. 1 million? Yeah, 1 million. Rough number. They might be a little over $1 million now. But they've basically been plateaued for the last bunch of years because they just got up to what they could do on their farm, and that's it. So I want to go back again. $1 million a day of yogurt. $1 million a year of yogurt. And the last one is micro. So this is Zoe Bradbury, a Stanford graduate who spent several years working for various NGOs and then went back to her mom's farm in Southern Oregon. And they farmed 10 acres, 2 sisters and a mom, largely with horsepower. They do have some tractors and stuff. They use horses whenever they can. And they have a CSA, a farm stand. They sell to some local restaurants. They do a little of everything. And it's rural Southern Oregon. And they are grossing $200,000 a year from 10 acres, sorry. So there's a whole lot of things to unpack in everything I'm saying. We don't have time to get into it, but I just wanted you have to decide, like, where is the change that we want? If we were going to rebuild, if we were going to, let's say, resettle America the right way the second time, big, audacious, Wendell Berry-ish kind of goal, help the pendulum come back from 5,000 and 10,000 acre commodity farms, which are the equivalent of the Chobani thing. I didn't get into all that, but just think about, 5,000 acre corn and soybean operation in the Midwest that's pumping chemicals into the ground. And here's a funny stat. Here's a quiz. How much time a year does the typical industrial farmer in the United States spend on each acre of his land? You have to think about it for a second. Well, we have about 0. You've got some serious skeptics in the front row here. So they're going to overshoot. They're going to overshoot any. Well, that's a great, no one has ever asked that in response to that question. So are they saying feet on the ground? That's part. So driving, no, just over the ground, whether they're in their combine or not, just on each acre, and it's almost all sitting in a $400,000 piece of equipment. So how much time on each acre, albeit driving? 45 minutes a year on each acre.
But it's on rubber wheels.
It's on rubber wheels. Okay, the reason I'm giving this, then flash to Elliot Coleman up in Maine, who some of you are going to know, who I'm proud to say was on the board of Slow Money for a number of years, is now an emeritus board member. When I told Elliot that, he laughed and he said, Woodman, that's what he calls me, how many hours are there in a year? That's how many hours I spend on each acre. He's only farming like 2 acres now, you know. Super intensive. He's grossing about $120,000 a year on a couple of acres of land. Totally different farm model. And there's, again, a lot to discuss in there. He has interns and different, you know, there's a whole lot of things to talk about in there. But you have to decide if you believe that downsizing, getting to smaller scale, if you believe in diversity, that's probably the cross-cutting issue of all of this. Biodiversity, diversity of life in the soil. There are trillions of microbes in like a shovelful of soil. Trillions. You know, some estimates are that there's more life under the soil than there is on top of the soil in terms of weight. So this is real stuff. The reason America is so, one of the reasons we are so blessed is because we have way more water and soil than most other countries, meaning navigable waterways, the rivers of the Midwest, and many, many, many feet of topsoil that were built over millennia. And we're actually degrading it, but there was so much there that it's still there, but we're losing it. Okay, the soil project. I'm going to shift gears here a little bit. And I should wrap up so we can have some questions. So I'm sorry I'm going a little over. The soil project. So slow opportunities for investing locally. What are we doing? After almost a decade of this various, believe it or not, discussions like this have catalyzed action around the United States. And that action takes the form of the 57+ million into the 600 little food deals. But it's very inefficient. And some of you probably have already figured out, like, how, it's just a lot of work to get a lot of small investing to happen. So I've been trying to figure out, is there some little magic, little trick we can do to make it a little more efficient? And this is my first attempt at that. How does it work? We're taking donations, starting at $250, no upper limit. So you only put in what you can afford to leave in. It's not about your returns, it's about leaving the returns in. Then we are voting, one person, one vote, no matter how much money you put in, and we're making 0% loans to farmers and others. So just think about that for a second. Donations in, 0% loans. We've been doing this for a few years in Carbondale, Colorado, as a kind of a test, and it's working beautifully there. And there we have a billionaire sitting next to literally sitting next to a startup farmer, and they're both voting on a loan to somebody down the street. And it's one of the coolest things I've ever had the pleasure of being a part of. That's how I experienced it. So we're going to say now we're starting one in Boulder. I won't, in the interest of time, I won't say more about that unless you ask me questions. I just wanted you to hear, it's an experiment. It seems very promising. And the reason for that format, the only thing I'll say is, if you imagine what we're doing in Boulder, $250,000 a year coming into this pool every year, hopefully growing that amount over time, and then we're making 0% loans from that, and starting in the third and fourth and fifth year, the principal of many of those 0% loans come back, as well as the flow that comes in. Eventually, we will have many millions of dollars in this permanent pool, and will be controlled completely by the members. So it's promising, and I will report back. Here are some of the things that are getting money through the slow money groups in Colorado. Most of these actually were 0% loans before soil existed, but that's a whole other story. I just wanted you to see a few things. So a small goat dairy in Boulder, a food co-op in Denver's poor zip code, a small organic family farm in Boulder County, a co-op that has been formed in Fort Collins, Colorado, to community ownership of farmland. Really interesting experiment. If they pull this off, they're in the process. They've got the membership, they got the money, and they lost the piece of land that they were trying to buy. But if this thing works with a modicum of success, that's going to be replicated in a lot of places. A fermented food company in Boulder that's sourcing all their cabbage locally. A 4-acre organic flower and vegetable farm on the western slope of Colorado that needed to buy a used refrigerated truck. Just imagine that farm. They gross $100,000 a year. They've been at it for 10 years. Great farmers. going into a bank to try to borrow money to buy a used truck. Not going to happen, right? So we lent them $23,500 for the used truck. And they paid it back way faster than we wanted them to. Why? They didn't like having the debt even though it was 0%, and they wanted to pay it forward for other farmers. The 0% thing really creates it is non-fiduciary, obviously. It's not about the financial return, it's about sharing risk, it's about sharing. And this is a young startup micro farm up in Carbondale, Colorado. They had tons of farming experience before. This is my last slide. It's a much cruder form of fiduciary imagination. It's the way my first book ended, and it is a poem. You'll see that diversity and fertility are loosely rhyming. Circulation versus percolation, monoculture versus diversity, transaction versus relationship, and profitability versus fertility. The values on the left are the system we have now, are the industrial, financial, and food system, and the values on the right are the values towards which we are wishing to move, which we are moving in our own little way. And so to wrap up, got applause the last time I read from this, so I'm going to try one more time. I'm just feeling we need a little energy here. All right. So this is the afterward, this is the last page of my book. Nurture and affection all around, given and received. To and from, and I just want you to remember, the book ends with 20 pages of pretty attractive photographs of a bunch of farmers and food people in Boulder. So it goes from all the way up here, all the way down to the ground. Nurture and affection all around, given and received. To and from local slow money leaders who invest themselves so graciously in the process of bringing money back down to earth. To and from board members and kitchen cabinetiers whose collaborative spirit is beautiful. To generous donors and investors, large and small, but especially small, because we're all small. When those fateful words were uttered, small is beautiful. A window is opened through which we have only begun to cast a few earnest, playful, sideways, inviting, mischievous, convivial, curious, lively, serious, diversity-loving, return agnostic, chore non-averse, beet-roasting, coquettish, roguish, meta-algorithmic glances. History is daunting, culture is precious, beauty is urgent, and nonviolence is just over the horizon, prepping a feast for a few billion of our closest friends.